My own parents gave me away to a stranger when I was 12 years old, simply because I was a daughter instead of a son. 20 years later, when my adoptive father passed away and left me his entire fortune, my biological family showed up at my penthouse door. They did not come to offer condolences or make amends. My birth father slammed a $10 million debt notice on my coffee table and demanded I pay it to save his golden boy. He looked me in the eye and told me blood saves blood. I just smiled and took a quiet sip of my bourbon because he had no idea I was about to buy his entire life and demolish it. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who completely underestimated your power. I am Nia, 32 years old, and I am the founder of one of the largest real estate acquisition funds in Atlanta. I spend my days navigating high-stakes corporate deals and managing a massive portfolio. The life I live now is one of absolute control and unapologetic luxury. I reside in a sprawling penthouse that overlooks the entire city skyline, a testament to the decades of relentless work I poured into my career. The space is filled with warm, light, minimalist furniture and the quiet hum of success. But my life did not start out this way. To understand the sheer audacity of what happened this morning, you have to understand where I came from. There is an old saying in our community that blood is thicker than water. People use it to excuse all kinds of terrible behavior. They forget that mud is also thicker than water, and all it really does is drag you down and make you dirty. When I was 12 years old, my biological parents, Desmond and Vivian, made a calculated decision that would alter the trajectory of my entire existence. They packed my meager belongings into a single battered suitcase and drove me to the estate of an older, wealthy benefactor named Elias Sterling. They did not shed a single tear when they left me there. Their reasoning was brutally simple and undeniably cruel. They were struggling financially, and they needed every spare dollar, every ounce of energy, and every available opportunity to pour into my younger brother, DeAndre. DeAndre was their golden child. He was the son, the heir, the one destined to carry the family name and lift them out of their working-class neighborhood. In their eyes, I was just a girl, a bad investment, an extra mouth to feed that offered no return. So they discarded me without a second thought. They told the neighbors I was going away to an elite boarding school on a scholarship, but the truth was, they traded me away for convenience. What Desmond and Vivian did not anticipate was who Elias Sterling truly was. He was not just a charitable man taking in a displaced child. Elias was a real estate mogul, an absolute shark in the business world, who recognized a survivor when he saw one. He took the broken pieces of my childhood and forged me into solid titanium. He taught me how to read complex legal contracts before I could legally drive a car. He showed me how to negotiate, how to spot a bad deal, and how to command a room full of people who wanted to see me fail. He became the real father I never had. When Elias passed away last month, the grief nearly consumed me. I lost my mentor, my protector, and my family. He left me his entire holding company, his properties, and his billions. The news of the transfer of wealth made the front page of every major business publication in the state. And like clockwork, the scent of fresh money brought the predators straight to my door. It happened at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. I was sitting on my leather sofa looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my balcony. The city of Atlanta was just waking up below me. I was holding a crystal glass of bourbon, rolling the amber liquid around, and enjoying the absolute silence of my sanctuary. Then the heavy mahogany double doors of my penthouse echoed with a loud, aggressive knock. My security team had been given strict orders regarding visitors, but these people had somehow managed to bypass the lobby desk by claiming a family emergency. When the doors swung open, the silence of my morning was shattered instantly. There they stood. Desmond and Vivian, my biological parents, looking older but carrying the exact same arrogant entitlement they possessed 20 years ago. Standing right between them was DeAndre. He was 28 years old now and dressed in loud, flashy designer clothing covered in logos. It was the universal uniform of new money and terrible credit. Clinging tightly to DeAndre's arm was his wife Chloe. She was a white woman gripping a counterfeit designer handbag and looking around my home with an insulting mixture of blatant awe and thinly veiled disgust. They marched into my home without waiting for an invitation. There was no greeting. There was no hesitation. There was absolutely no mention of Elias or a single word of condolence for the man who had actually raised me and provided for me when they refused to do so. Vivian walked straight past my foyer, dropping her cheap coat onto a custom sculpture I had imported from Italy. She surveyed the minimalist luxury of my living room, clicked her tongue, and loudly declared that the place looked cold and completely lacked family warmth. She spoke as if she had any right to judge the home she was standing in as an uninvited guest. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I simply remained on my sofa, crossing my legs and taking another slow sip of my drink, watching them invade my space. Desmond did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. He walked right up to my custom marble coffee table and violently slammed a thick stack of legal documents down onto the surface. The sharp smack of the paper hitting the stone echoed through the high ceilings. He looked down at me with the exact same cold, indifferent eyes that had watched me cry in the rearview mirror 2 decades ago. "DeAndre is in a little bit of trouble," he commanded, his voice booming with unearned authority. "His investment firm is facing a minor setback, and he owes $10 million. We saw the news, Nia. We know you just inherited a massive fortune from that old man. You need to write a check right now and clear your brother's debt. Family has to stick together and blood saves blood." I stared at the crumpled debt notice resting on my pristine table. $10 million. They had the audacity to abandon me as a child, erase me from their lives, and then barge into my home decades later, demanding a $10 million bailout for the very boy they replaced me with. Before I could even process the sheer delusion of Desmond's demand, Chloe decided to interject. She adjusted her posture, shifting her weight, and looked down her nose at me with an air of complete superiority. "You know Nia?" she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You really need to understand that DeAndre carries the primary family name. You are just a woman, and frankly, you are incredibly lucky that Mr. Sterling decided to give you his charity. You should be grateful that we still consider you part of this family and are giving you the opportunity to contribute to your brother's legacy." The absolute gall of this woman entering my house and attempting to put me in my place was almost comical. She stood there reeking of entitlement, demanding my money while simultaneously insulting my gender and my inheritance. She thought she could use her privilege to intimidate me in my own domain, acting as if my billions were just a lucky accident rather than the result of 20 years of grueling work under the toughest real estate titan in the city. I slowly lowered my crystal glass to the table, setting it down right next to their ridiculous demand. I looked at Vivian, who was nodding along with Chloe's statement. I looked at DeAndre, who was avoiding my gaze and staring at my expensive artwork. Then I looked at Desmond, whose chest was puffed out, expecting immediate compliance. They actually believed I was the same terrified 12-year-old girl they had discarded. They truly thought they could waltz in here, use the word family as a weapon, and walk out with millions. I smiled gently, leaning back against the leather cushions. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply looked at the 4 of them standing in my living room, completely unaware of the absolute destruction they had just invited into their lives. I picked up the pathetic debt notice Desmond had thrown on my table. I held it between my manicured fingers, feeling the cheap paper, and then I deliberately tore it right down the middle. I let the pieces flutter onto the imported marble floor. The sound of the paper tearing was the only noise in the penthouse for a solid 5 seconds. Desmond's chest puffed out his face, turning a deep, volatile shade of red, while DeAndre nervously shifted his weight. I did not raise my voice when I spoke, because true power never has to shout. I looked directly into the eyes of the people who shared my DNA and reminded them of a cold, torrential Tuesday night, exactly 20 years ago. I asked them if they remembered the heavy black trash bags they used to pack my belongings, because they refused to waste money on a suitcase for a daughter they were discarding. I asked if they remembered how DeAndre, their precious golden child, sat in the living room playing with a brand new video game console while they drove me to a stranger's house and walked away without looking back. I told them they did not just give me away that night, they erased me. Vivian did not flinch. Most mothers would shatter at the memory of abandoning their own flesh and blood. Most humans possess a basic foundation of guilt or shame. Vivian possessed absolutely neither. The fragile mask of a concerned, desperate mother instantly dissolved, revealing the bitter, grasping woman underneath. She let out a sharp, ugly laugh that echoed against my high ceilings. She slammed her hand down on the coffee table, rattling my crystal bourbon glass. She told me I was completely ungrateful. She pointed a manicured finger at my face and shrieked that if they had not dumped me like useless baggage, I would never have met Elias Sterling. She actually demanded that I get on my knees and thank her for the trauma of my childhood, claiming that her cruelty was the only reason I was currently sitting in a multi-million-dollar penthouse. I watched her chest heave with indignation. The sheer audacity was almost breathtaking. But Vivian was not finished. She reached into her oversized counterfeit designer tote bag and pulled out a faded manila envelope. She ripped it open and slapped a single yellowed sheet of paper onto the table right next to my drink. I did not move. I simply let my eyes scan the document. It was a medical certificate dated 2 decades ago. The header belonged to a shady, defunct psychiatric clinic in our old neighborhood. The patient name listed was mine. The diagnosis was entirely fabricated. It stated that a 12-year-old Nia suffered from severe psychological disorders, pathological lying, and manipulative sociopathic tendencies. Desmond stepped forward, trying to use his physical size to tower over me. They stood over my sofa, casting long, desperate shadows across my living room, genuinely believing their physical height gave them the upper hand. They did not realize that a king does not need to stand up to rule a kingdom. Desmond pointed at the forged medical record with a thick, shaking finger. He laid out his master plan with a smug, victorious grin. He told me that they had kept this document locked away for 20 years. He threatened to march straight down to the Fulton County Probate Court and file a massive lawsuit against me. He leaned in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He whispered his threat with absolute venom. They were going to tell a judge that I was a clinical sociopath. They would swear under oath that I had spent the last 20 years using my documented psychological manipulation tactics to prey on a vulnerable elderly Elias Sterling. They would argue that I brainwashed a lonely billionaire into leaving me an entire real estate empire, and that I was mentally unfit to control the Sterling assets. Desmond spelled out the consequences with sadistic pleasure. He knew exactly how the legal system worked. The moment a family member contested a will with allegations of elder abuse and psychological manipulation, the court would instantly freeze the entire estate. Every single bank account, every property deed, every investment portfolio, and every corporate asset would be locked down tight. He promised me that the legal battle would drag on for a grueling 10 years. The lawyers would bleed the estate dry, and my entire life's work would be paralyzed in a suffocating web of litigation. Then came the ultimatum, the demand that was supposed to break me. Desmond crossed his arms, looking down at me with the absolute certainty of a predator who thought he had cornered his prey. $10 million, he demanded, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He told me that $10 million was the exact price to make that forged medical certificate disappear forever. He ordered me to open my checkbook, transfer the funds to save his precious golden child DeAndre from his massive debt, and in return they would walk out of my penthouse and let me keep the rest of my billions in peace. He gave me a simple, brutal choice. Pay the $10 million today or lose access to everything I owned for the next decade. They stood there, a united front of greed and desperation, waiting for me to panic. They expected me to beg, to negotiate, to show fear at the prospect of losing the empire I had sacrificed my entire youth to build. They thought this dirty piece of paper was a lethal weapon. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent my entire life navigating rooms full of ruthless corporate sharks and this pathetic attempt at extortion was nothing more than a mosquito buzzing against bulletproof glass. I kept my face perfectly still, analyzing the fatal flaws in their desperate strategy. I was not looking at a threat. I was looking at a group of people who had just handed me the exact rope I would use to hang them. The silence in the room stretched just long enough for Chloe to mistake my calculation for surrender. She shifted her weight on her designer heels that were clearly from last season's discount rack and stepped forward. Her grip tightened on her counterfeit handbag. It is fascinating how fake leather squeaks in a quiet room. She looked at me with a perfectly practiced smile. It was the kind of smile weaponized by women who use politeness to deliver poison. "You really need to look at the bigger picture here, Nia," she said. Her voice was soft, breathy, and saturated with an unbearable level of condescension. "We are actually trying to help you. You have been given this massive stroke of luck. It is incredible, really. A sweet little charity case plucked from obscurity by a lonely old man. But let us be honest with ourselves. You do not know the first thing about managing this level of wealth or running a legitimate enterprise." I kept my gaze locked on her face. I let her speak. I wanted her to empty every drop of venom she had stored up. "DeAndre is different." Chloe continued, her chest puffing out with borrowed pride. "He was raised for this. He went to a top-tier university. He has the network, the pedigree, and the vision to navigate the real business world. He is the true elite of this family. You should view this $10 million not as a penalty, but as an investment. You are buying a seat at the table. You should be immensely grateful that DeAndre is allowing you to contribute to his legacy." The racial and class microaggressions were so thick they practically suffocated the air in my living room. Here was a woman who married into my biological family solely for the illusion of wealth, actively telling me, a black woman who had spent 2 decades cutting her teeth in the most cutthroat commercial real estate markets on the East Coast, that I was merely a beneficiary of pity. She was implying that my billionaire mentor was just a foolish old man, and that my entire existence was a fluke. According to Chloe, I was just holding the money until a real man like DeAndre could come along and put it to good use. She tilted her head, looking at me with feigned sympathy. "Just write the check, honey. We will take the medical certificate and we will leave. We can finally be a real family again. You can go back to pretending you are a corporate titan, and DeAndre can get back to doing the actual heavy lifting in the business world." DeAndre nodded along with his wife. He actually looked proud of her speech. Desmond crossed his massive arms, waiting for me to break down in tears and reach for my pen. Vivian was practically vibrating with victory. They had cornered the wild animal. They had played their trump card. They expected me to start bargaining, to scream obscenities, to throw a tantrum fit for the emotionally unstable child described in their forged medical documents. If I fought back with anger, I would be giving them exactly what they wanted. I would be validating their narrative. I would be the angry, unstable woman they needed me to be. Instead, I let the absolute silence of the penthouse swallow her words. The air conditioning hummed softly. The ice in my bourbon glass shifted with a sharp clink. I looked at the forged medical certificate resting on my marble table. I looked at Chloe's smug face. I looked at the brother who thought he was a king while drowning in $10 million of debt. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the polished steel doors of my private elevator slide open. Marcus, my personal head of security, stepped into the foyer. He was a mountain of a man dressed in a sharp black suit. He took one look at Desmond's aggressive posture and Chloe's pointing finger, and his hand immediately went to his earpiece. He stepped forward, ready to physically drag all 4 of them out of my home by their collars. I did not even turn my head. I simply raised a single manicured finger in the air. Marcus froze instantly. He dropped his hand, took a step back into the shadows, and remained perfectly still. He was a professional. He knew exactly what that gesture meant. It meant the prey was in the trap, and he was not to disturb the hunt. I uncrossed my legs and leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees. I looked directly into Chloe's eyes. I let my gaze strip away all her false superiority until she nervously adjusted her grip on her fake handbag. I did not raise my voice. I did not use a single vulgar word. I spoke with the calm, chilling authority of an executioner reading a sentence. "All right," I said. My voice was smooth and perfectly even. The single word hung in the air. Desmond's posture instantly relaxed. Vivian let out a loud breath of relief. DeAndre smiled a wide, arrogant grin that showed all his teeth. Chloe looked around the room as if expecting applause for her brilliant negotiation skills. I picked up the forged medical certificate, holding it by the corner as if it were contaminated. I folded it neatly, precisely down the middle, and tucked it into the pocket of my blazer. $10 million is a substantial amount of liquid capital. I continued, matching Chloe's soft, business-like tone. It requires moving funds, liquidating short-term assets, and drafting the proper transfer agreements. I cannot simply write a personal check for that amount on a Tuesday morning. Desmond stepped forward, his greed making him impatient. "We do not have time for games, Nia. The creditors are breathing down his neck." "I am not playing games, Desmond," I replied, keeping my eyes locked on him. "I am giving you exactly what you asked for. But business is business. You want $10 million to clear DeAndre's debt. I will pay it. But you need to give me 3 days to get the money together." They looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. They were calculating whether I was stalling or if they had actually won. The sheer magnitude of my wealth blinded them to the obvious trap. They thought my compliance was a result of their brilliant strategy. They thought the forged medical certificate had terrified me into submission. 3 days, Desmond said, his voice gruff, but layered with satisfaction. Not a minute longer. We will be back on Friday morning. If you try to pull anything, if you call your lawyers, or try to hide the money, that certificate goes straight to the judge. You will be locked out of your own bank accounts before noon. Understood, I said simply. Friday morning. I will have everything ready. Chloe gave me one last patronizing smile. You are making the right choice, Nia. Family is everything. It is good to see you finally understanding your place. I watched them turn around and walk toward the elevator. They walked with the swagger of conquerors. They were already spending the money in their heads. DeAndre was probably planning his next disastrous investment. Chloe was mentally purchasing a real designer bag. Vivian and Desmond were plotting how to extract even more wealth from me in the future. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they did not realize they had just given a billionaire with unlimited resources 72 hours of unchecked freedom. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of their triumphant laughter. The penthouse descended back into total silence. Marcus stepped out from the hallway, his face completely unreadable. "Do you need me to wipe the security footage of them entering the building, Miss Sterling?" he asked. "No, Marcus," I replied, standing up and smoothing out my blazer. "Make sure the footage is backed up to 3 separate servers. We are going to need a perfect record of their faces when this week is over." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the sprawling city. The sunlight caught the glass of the high-rise buildings in the financial district. I had told them I needed 3 days to gather the money. It was a complete lie. I could have transferred $10 million from my phone before they even finished their first sentence. But I did not need 3 days to find the money. I needed 3 days to absolutely obliterate their entire existence. I needed 3 days to buy every single debt DeAndre owed. I needed 3 days to trace every single fraudulent transaction in his failing company. I needed 3 days to legally acquire the mortgage on Desmond and Vivian's house. They wanted to use a forged piece of paper from 20 years ago to threaten my empire. I was going to use the full weight of the federal banking system to crush theirs. They thought they were extorting a scared little girl. They did not know they had just handed the keys to their destruction to the woman who owned the bank. Before the polished steel doors of the private elevator could completely seal them away, DeAndre could not resist one final pathetic display of dominance. He planted his custom sneaker on the marble threshold, holding the heavy door open just long enough to ensure he had the absolute last word. His chest was puffed out with the artificial confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully intimidated a titan in her own fortress. He looked across the expansive foyer, his eyes raking over my imported artwork and custom furniture, with a mixture of intense jealousy and unearned entitlement. "You know, Nia," he called out, his voice echoing off the high acoustic walls of my living room. "It is actually hilarious. You get to live up here in this glass castle and play the role of a billionaire, but at the end of the day, you are still exactly what you were 20 years ago. You are just the leftover we did not want to keep, the spare part. The stray dog Desmond and Vivian threw away because you were a bad bet. Do not ever forget your actual place in this family when you sign that check on Friday. You are just paying rent for the privilege of carrying our blood." He pulled his foot back and let the heavy doors glide shut with a solid metallic click. The mechanical hum of the elevator descending was the only sound left in the penthouse. I stood up slowly from the leather sofa. My movements were deliberate and completely devoid of the panic they had so desperately hoped to inspire. The morning sun was fully cresting over the Atlanta skyline, now bathing the city in a sharp, unforgiving light that exposed every crack and crevice of the concrete grid below. I walked toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, watching the tiny vehicles navigate the crowded arteries of the financial district. I observed the city with the same cold, calculating focus a hawk uses to track field mice from a thermal updraft. DeAndre thought his parting words were a fatal strike to my ego. He genuinely believed that reminding me of my childhood abandonment would somehow cripple my resolve and send me spiraling into a pit of emotional despair. He was spectacularly wrong. His insult did not wound me. It completely liberated me. It severed the very last microscopic thread of biological obligation that polite society insists we must feel toward the people who happen to contribute to our genetics. They had walked into my sanctuary carrying a forged 20-year-old psychiatric evaluation from a defunct back-alley clinic, thinking it was the ultimate trump card. They truly believed that threatening to freeze my assets with a bogus probate lawsuit would force me to surrender $10 million to cover up DeAndre's catastrophic business failures. My 3-day extension was never about gathering the liquid capital. I could have authorized a wire transfer for $10 million from my encrypted smartphone before they even finished demanding it. The delay was a tactical maneuver. It was a carefully deployed smokescreen, designed to send them home feeling victorious and completely oblivious to the massacre that was about to unfold. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out their pathetic piece of blackmail. I smoothed the crinkled yellowed paper against the cool glass of the window. A 12-year-old girl suffering from severe psychological disorders and pathological lying. I let a genuine razor-sharp smile touch the corners of my mouth. They thought this piece of paper was a loaded gun pointed directly at my head. They failed to realize it was actually a signed confession of their own parental malpractice and a desperate admission of their current financial terror. I turned away from the panoramic view of the city and walked straight to my expansive mahogany desk. I bypassed my personal cell phone and picked up the secure encrypted landline that connected directly to the war room of my firm. I did not need to consult a directory or wait for an assistant. I dialed a specific internal extension and waited exactly 2 rings before a sharp alert voice answered. It was Jonathan, my lead corporate attorney, and the ruthless head of my forensic audit strike team. He is a man who thrives on tearing apart offshore shell companies, piercing corporate veils, and finding the buried financial skeletons of arrogant men. He does not ask emotional questions. He simply executes commands with lethal administrative precision. "Jonathan," I said, my voice dropping into the low authoritative register that commanded boardrooms and terrified rival executives. "I need you to completely freeze my entire schedule for the next 72 hours. Cancel the zoning committee meeting with the mayor. Push the commercial high-rise acquisition in Buckhead to next Tuesday. Rebook my flight to New York. I am initiating a hostile financial lockdown immediately." There was a brief rustle of paper on the other end of the line, before Jonathan replied with absolute professional calm, confirming the immediate cancellations. He knew my tone, and he knew that a hostile lockdown meant we were pivoting from standard acquisitions to absolute financial warfare. "I have a new target." I continued pacing slowly behind my desk and tracing the grain of the wood with my fingertips. His name is DeAndre. He runs a mid-level boutique investment firm that operates out of a leased office space in Midtown. I want your entire team focused exclusively on this assignment starting 5 minutes ago. I want you to pull every single public record, every tax filing, every vendor contract, and every outstanding loan associated with his name and his business entity. You are going to turn his company inside out. Turn every single contract he has ever signed upside down. I want to see the microscopic details of his failures. I paused, letting the weight of the directive settle over the encrypted line before delivering the kill shot. He currently owes $10 million to an undisclosed group of creditors. I want to know exactly who holds that paper by noon today. I want to know the names of the banks, the private equity firms, or the desperate loan sharks he is currently bleeding for. And Jonathan, once you find out who holds his debt, I want you to buy it. Buy all of it. Use the discretionary acquisition fund and pay a premium percentage if you have to, just to expedite the process. I want those promissory notes legally transferred into my primary holding company. By the time the sun goes down on Wednesday, I intend to be his sole legal creditor. I want to own the air he breathes. Jonathan did not hesitate or ask for clarification. He simply asked for the exact spelling of the business name and promised a preliminary dossier within 2 hours. But I was not finished. The retaliation had to be comprehensive and absolute. It had to encompass the entire invading party. Furthermore, I instructed leaning forward and resting my knuckles on the desk. I need a deep forensic dive on a woman named Chloe. She is DeAndre's wife. Pull her credit history, her employment records, her offshore holdings, and any bank accounts registered under her maiden name. People who carry counterfeit designer bags and walk into my penthouse demanding unearned respect usually have significant financial leaks of their own. Find her leak. Dig until you find the dirty money she is trying to hide from her husband. And finally pull the mortgage records on Desmond and Vivian's primary residence. They bought a sprawling, oversized house in Alpharetta 5 years ago that they absolutely cannot afford. Find out who holds their deed. If they are behind on their mortgage payments, I want to purchase that debt portfolio as well. I want the keys to their front door sitting on my desk by Friday morning. I placed the receiver back onto the cradle with a soft, decisive click. The transition was complete. The terrified 12-year-old girl who was driven away in the back of a beaten-up sedan was officially dead and permanently buried. In her place stood the apex predator of the Atlanta real estate market. My biological family had walked into my sanctuary demanding $10 million to cover up their own catastrophic failures. They had banked on the societal expectation that a daughter must unconditionally submit to her parents regardless of their toxic transgressions. They thought my gender made me weak and my wealth made me a prime target for easy extortion. They fundamentally failed to understand the basic mechanics of power. Power is not just about having commas and zeros in a bank account. It is about knowing exactly how to weaponize that money to control the narrative and crush your opposition. They thought they had backed me into a corner by threatening to freeze my assets with a forged psychological evaluation. They believed I was desperate to protect my pristine corporate reputation from a messy public scandal. But Elias Sterling did not raise a victim. He raised a master strategist. He taught me that when an opponent draws a knife, you do not panic and you do not negotiate. You buy the factory that manufactures the knives and you fire everyone inside. My 3-day deadline was not a grace period for me to gather funds or mourn the loss of my biological family. It was a ticking time bomb carefully planted right beneath their feet. Over the next 72 hours, my audit strike team would systematically strip away every single layer of DeAndre's fake corporate success. They would expose the rotten core of his business practices and lay bare the fraudulent foundation of his entire life. The $10 million debt was just the surface-level symptom of a much deeper fatal disease. I was going to map out every single financial artery in his life, and I was going to surgically sever them all. When Friday morning arrived and they walked back through my penthouse doors expecting a surrender, They would instead be walking into a meticulously constructed financial slaughterhouse. I picked up the forged medical certificate one last time, holding it up to the morning light. It was a flimsy, pathetic piece of ammunition. I walked over to the heavy-duty electric shredder tucked discreetly next to my filing cabinet. I fed the yellowed paper into the metal teeth and listened to the satisfying mechanical grind as the machine chewed their 20-year-old lie into 100 unrecognizable pieces. The threat was neutralized not by fear, but by absolute unyielding dominance. I poured myself a fresh glass of iced water from the crystal pitcher on my credenza, taking a long, slow drink. The hunt had officially begun, and I was not going to stop until I owned every single thing they held dear. The camera whips in a rapid, dizzying motion, tracking my purposeful strides as I move from the living room directly into my private executive office. The sleek panoramic glass doors slide shut behind me, sealing out the rest of the penthouse. As I walk deeper into the room, the motion sensors detect my presence, and the massive wall of interactive holographic monitors hums to life, casting an icy blue glow across the darkened space. Lines of code financial matrices and cascading spreadsheets immediately begin to populate, reflecting in my eyes as I stand before the digital command center. It takes exactly 4 hours for Jonathan and his elite forensic audit strike team to peel back the polished, expensive veneer of DeAndre's life and expose the rotting foundation underneath. My secure, encrypted landline chimes breaking the quiet hum of the servers. I tap the earpiece, answering immediately. "We have the preliminary dossier, Miss Sterling." Jonathan states, his voice stripped of any inflection, acting as a pure conduit of devastating facts. And it is significantly worse than a simple liquidity crisis. I instruct him to project the findings directly onto my main display. Document after document materializes on the glass. I watch as 20 years of Desmond and Vivian's delusional parenting manifests into digital evidence of absolute ruin. They had raised DeAndre to believe he was an untouchable prince, bestowing upon him a crown made of maxed-out credit cards and highly leveraged assets. They had pumped hundreds of thousands of dollars into his boutique investment firm, trying to artificially manufacture the generational wealth they so desperately wanted to project to their affluent country club friends. They paid for his out-of-state tuition, his luxury vehicles, and his imported tailored suits, believing that projecting the image of a corporate titan was the exact same thing as actually being one. DeAndre's company was nothing more than a spectacular hollow shell. It was a glorified Ponzi scheme, wrapped in corporate buzzwords and aggressive marketing jargon. He had no actual revenue streams, no legitimate asset management portfolio, and zero institutional investors. He was simply moving borrowed money from one shell account to another to maintain the illusion of high-yield returns for a very select group of volatile investors. Walk me through the $10 million deficit. Jonathan, I command my eyes, tracking a particularly alarming series of wire transfers highlighted in neon red on the screen. It is not a standard business loan, Jonathan explains, the rapid typing of his keyboard clacking in the background. DeAndre has been heavily involved in commercial mortgage fraud at the federal level. He has been systematically inflating property appraisals, securing massive loans against those artificially inflated values, and then transferring the capital to offshore accounts to fund his and Chloe's extravagant lifestyle. When the real estate market shifted and the initial balloon payments came due, he panicked. He took out predatory loans from unregulated shadow lenders to cover the commercial bank payments. The $10 million he is demanding from you is not to save his legitimate business. It is the exact amount he needs to stop a syndicate of very dangerous private creditors from liquidating his physical assets and potentially threatening his life. I let out a slow, measured breath. The sheer monumental stupidity of his actions is almost breathtaking. He had walked into my penthouse, puffing his chest, demanding respect and reminding me of my abandoned past, while secretly drowning in a criminal conspiracy of his own making. Chloe had stood in my living room wearing her discount designer shoes and mocking my intelligence, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband had financed her entire privileged existence through federal wire fraud. There is a secondary complication, Jonathan adds, and I can hear the rare trace of grim satisfaction in his usually robotic tone. DeAndre was incredibly sloppy. He left a digital paper trail a mile wide. The shadow lenders are actually the least of his problems right now. Our system flagged a series of sealed subpoenas originating from the Department of Justice. The FBI White-Collar Crime Division has a shadow docket open on his firm. They have been quietly monitoring his wire transfers and dummy corporations for the past 8 months. They are currently building a massive federal RICO case against him and several of his associates. I stare at the digital web of illicit transactions, completely mesmerized by the sheer scale of his arrogance. If I had written that $10 million check this morning, the federal government would have instantly flagged the massive transfer. I would have been legally implicated as an accessory to federal mortgage fraud and money laundering. Desmond had threatened to accuse me of manipulating a billionaire, but his precious golden child was literally stealing millions from federal banking institutions. Their brilliant extortion plan would have dragged me directly into a federal indictment. What about my parents? I ask, intentionally using the word with absolute clinical detachment. How deep is Desmond's financial grave? Another file populates on my screen, overlaying the FBI shadow docket. It is the deed to their sprawling mansion in Alpharetta. The property they always featured so prominently in their holiday newsletters, the ultimate symbol of their supposed upper-class supremacy and undeniable proof that they had succeeded without me. It is a complete house of cards, Jonathan confirms. Desmond co-signed multiple initial business loans for DeAndre using the Alpharetta property as primary collateral. When DeAndre's scheme started hemorrhaging cash, Desmond took out a second mortgage to keep the business afloat and hide the losses from Vivian. 6 months later, Vivian took out a third highly leveraged equity line of credit to maintain their country club lifestyle and cover Chloe's extravagant wedding demands. The property is currently mortgaged 3 times over its actual market appraisal value. I pull up the payment history, watching the columns of numbers turn from a stable black to a glaring terminal red. They are 90 days delinquent on all 3 mortgages, Jonathan states coldly. The primary lending institution has already drafted the notice of default. The foreclosure process will officially initiate by next Monday morning. They do not own that house, Miss Sterling. The bank owns it, and the bank is currently preparing to physically evict them. I reach out and touch the cold glass of the monitor, resting my fingertips directly over the bright red foreclosure notice. A profound, heavy silence settles over my office. It is not a silence of pity or sorrow. It is the absolute silence of ultimate vindication. 20 years ago, they threw me away like defective garbage because they claimed I was a liability. They packed my belongings in black trash bags because I was not worth the price of a suitcase. They devoted every single ounce of their energy, every dollar to their name, and every drop of their affection to a son they believed was destined to elevate their family name. They built an entire religion around DeAndre's supposed superiority. And now here they were, standing completely blindfolded on the precipice of total annihilation. DeAndre was looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny and wire fraud. Desmond and Vivian were days away from having their luxury possessions tossed onto the front lawn of their foreclosed mansion by county sheriffs. And Chloe, the woman who had dared to lecture me about the elite class and my place in society, was about to find out that her entire marriage was financed by stolen money and phantom assets. They were not victims of circumstance or bad luck. They were the sole architects of their own destruction. They had come to me not as family seeking salvation, but as cornered, desperate rats trying to bite the only person who had the power to save them. They wanted to use a forged psychiatric evaluation from a defunct clinic to extort me while they were committing actual federal crimes. Jonathan, I say, my voice perfectly steady, echoing with the chilling authority of a woman who is about to execute a flawless checkmate. I do not want to save them. I want to own the execution. Awaiting your orders, Miss Sterling, he replies instantly, the clicking of his keyboard pausing. Contact the primary lending institution holding the mortgages on the Alpharetta property. I want you to buy all 3 notes. Pay whatever premium is necessary to expedite the transfer of the debt to my private holding company. Do not negotiate the price, just acquire the paper. By Thursday afternoon, I want to be the sole legal entity holding the deed to Desmond and Vivian's house. Consider it done. And DeAndre, do not touch his federal problems. Let the FBI continue their investigation completely undisturbed. We will not interfere with a pending federal indictment. However, I want you to locate the private shadow creditors holding his immediate $10 million debt. Buy that paper. Buy every single outstanding promissory note he has signed in the last 36 months. I want him legally bound to me. I want his financial survival entirely dependent on my signature. You are purchasing highly toxic debt, Miss Sterling. The return on investment is effectively zero. The return on investment is not financial, Jonathan. It is theatrical. I am not buying their debt to collect interest or salvage their credit. I am buying the exact rope they are going to use to hang themselves. Procure the documents. Draft the transfer agreements. Have the physical paperwork sitting on my desk by 8 o'clock Friday morning. Understood perfectly. I terminate the connection and step back from the glowing monitors. The sprawling digital spiderweb of their lies and crimes illuminates the darkened office, casting long shadows against the walls. They had asked for 3 days. I had given them 3 days to dream about my money, to plan their fake rescue, to celebrate their supposed dominance over the discarded daughter. They had absolutely no idea that while they were sleeping soundly in their beds, I was quietly buying the ground beneath their feet. I pour myself a fresh glass of iced water from the crystal pitcher on my desk, taking a long, slow drink as I look out over the city. On Friday, they would walk back into my penthouse expecting a certified check for $10 million. They would expect to walk out as victorious conquerors, having successfully put me back in my place. Instead, I was going to hand them the foreclosure notice to their home, the legal documentation of their insurmountable debt, and the absolute undeniable proof that the daughter they threw away now owned their entire miserable world. The hunters had effectively become the hunted, and they had willingly walked directly into the cage. The icy blue glow of the holographic monitor reflected in my eyes as a sudden frantic cascade of red data streamed across the glass surface. I was about to step away from the terminal when the encrypted line chimed again. Jonathan was not finished. The rapid rhythmic clacking of his mechanical keyboard echoed through the speaker, indicating that his forensic audit team had just struck a fresh, entirely unexpected nerve. I leaned back over the mahogany desk, bracing my hands against the polished edge, and watched the numbers rearrange themselves into a highly obfuscated financial web. "We have a massive secondary anomaly, Miss Sterling," Jonathan announced, his voice dropping an octave tighter and more urgent than before. "And it does not belong to DeAndre." I kept my eyes locked on the screen, watching a complex network of wire transfers materialize. "Walk me through it, Jonathan," I commanded. "DeAndre is a fool, but he is a predictable fool," Jonathan explained, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he sent real-time data packets directly to my display. "His mortgage fraud scheme is sloppy and arrogant. He has been funneling the stolen federal loan money directly into his own personal holding accounts to fund his luxury cars and his country club dues. But there is another entirely separate bleed on his corporate accounts. A highly sophisticated parasitic siphon that has been systematically draining his remaining capital for the past 14 months. My eyes tracked the glowing digits as they crawled across the glass display. I watched the flow of capital leave DeAndre's primary business account, bounce through a domestic limited liability company in Delaware, and then vanish into an international wire transfer. "Someone is bleeding him dry," I observed, tracking the pattern. "And they are doing it with a level of precision DeAndre is completely incapable of executing." "Exactly," Jonathan confirmed. "This is not DeAndre's work. This bypasses his authorization entirely. Someone set up a series of recurring ghost invoices for phantom consulting fees. Every time DeAndre secures a new fraudulent mortgage loan, exactly 20% of the liquid cash is instantly diverted to this Delaware shell company. From Delaware, it is immediately wired to a numbered offshore account in the Cayman Islands." I leaned closer to the monitor. The sheer audacity of the embezzlement was staggering. "Who owns the Delaware shell company, Jonathan?" "That is where it gets incredibly fascinating, Miss Sterling. The registered agent for the Delaware entity is a man named Bradley Jenkins. He is a mid-level accountant residing in suburban Ohio. He has no history of corporate consulting, no real estate license, and zero connection to the Atlanta commercial market. But a quick cross-reference of vital records reveals his true value to this operation. Bradley Jenkins is the biological brother of Chloe Jenkins, your sister-in-law. I slowly tilted my head up away from the glowing screen. A cold, dangerous smile spread across my face, filling the quiet emptiness of the penthouse. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with breathtaking clarity. Chloe, the perfect, pristine white sister-in-law who had stood in my living room less than an hour ago, delivering a condescending lecture about DeAndre's inherent superiority. The woman who had proudly proclaimed that her husband was the true elite of the family while branding me a lucky charity case. She had stood on my imported marble floors clutching a counterfeit designer handbag and demanded I show gratitude for being allowed to contribute to her husband's legacy. She was not a loyal wife blindly supporting her arrogant husband. She was a deeply calculating parasite who knew exactly how fast DeAndre's ship was sinking. She had seen the federal red flags. She knew the business was a hollow house of cards destined to collapse under the weight of his incompetence. Instead of warning him or trying to save his company, she had silently attached herself to his jugular and started sucking out the marrow. She was siphoning the stolen federal funds, packing her golden parachute, and preparing to completely abandon him the second the FBI kicked down their front door. "How much has she taken?" I asked, my voice a low hum of pure predatory satisfaction. "As of this morning, the Cayman Island account holds exactly $3.2 million, Jonathan replied. She has been accelerating the transfers over the last 30 days. She knows the end is coming, Miss Sterling. She is actively liquidating whatever cash he has left. If you had written that $10 million check today, she would have immediately diverted at least $2 million of it straight to her offshore haven before DeAndre even had the chance to pay off his shadow creditors." I let out a soft, chilling laugh that vibrated with absolute triumph. The supreme hypocrisy of her existence was almost beautiful in its ugliness. Chloe had weaponized her race and her perceived class status to patronize me. She utilized her soft, breathy tone and her practiced, polite smile to disguise her blatant thievery. She believed her inherent privilege made her invisible to suspicion. She thought she could march into the home of a black female billionaire, hurl thinly veiled racial microaggressions about my lack of pedigree, and then walk out with her pockets lined with stolen money. She genuinely believed she was the smartest person in the room. She thought she was playing all of us. She was playing DeAndre, playing Desmond and Vivian, and attempting to play me. She wore cheap fake leather shoes and carried a counterfeit bag, not because she was struggling, but because she was hoarding millions of dollars in untraceable cash. She was performing the role of the devoted, supportive wife while secretly digging her husband's financial grave. "Jonathan," I said, my tone sharpening into a lethal blade, "I want absolute, indisputable documentation of every single transaction she has made. I want the wire transfer receipts, the fake consulting invoices, and the Cayman Island account numbers. I want Bradley Jenkins' tax records proving he is acting as a willing accomplice to federal money laundering. I want it all compiled into a single, heavily bound dossier." "You will have it on your desk by tomorrow morning," Miss Sterling, Jonathan assured me, the rapid clicking of his keyboard verifying his promise. "Do you want me to forward this information to the FBI field office investigating DeAndre? Let the federal agents handle her embezzlement as part of the larger RICO case." I shook my head even though he could not see me. "No, Jonathan. The federal government will get their turn, but I am not handing over my leverage just yet. Chloe thinks she is an untouchable mastermind. She thinks she can hide behind her curated image of innocence and superiority. I want the profound pleasure of ripping that mask off her face myself." I walked away from the glowing monitors and poured myself another glass of iced water, letting the profound reality of my impending victory wash over me. The entire dynamic of the upcoming Friday meeting had just radically shifted. Desmond, Vivian, and DeAndre were coming back to my penthouse under the delusion that they were a united front. They believed their shared greed bound them together into an unstoppable force against me. They thought they were a loyal family, extracting resources from the outcast. But there is no loyalty among thieves, and there is certainly no loyalty among cowards. When they walked back through my private elevator doors, I was not just going to hand them their financial death warrants. I was going to detonate a psychological nuclear bomb right in the middle of their fragile alliance. DeAndre was a volatile, arrogant man whose entire fragile ego was built on the illusion of control. He believed he was the undisputed king of his household. He believed Chloe adored him and worshipped his business acumen. I pictured the exact moment I would slide that dossier across the marble table. I pictured DeAndre's face when he realized his perfect obedient wife was the very reason his company was hemorrhaging cash. I pictured Desmond and Vivian discovering that their precious white daughter-in-law, whom they constantly praised and elevated above me, had been actively robbing their golden child blind. The sheer catastrophic betrayal would shatter them from the inside out. They would turn on each other like starving wolves in a cage. I would not even have to raise my voice to destroy them. I would simply present the undeniable truth and watch them tear each other to absolute shreds. Chloe had commanded me to look at the bigger picture. She had ordered me to understand my place and be grateful for the opportunity to save her husband. She had no idea how perfectly I had mapped out that bigger picture. She was about to learn that when you step into the arena with a true apex predator, you do not get to dictate the terms of your own survival. Print the dossier on heavy premium stock, Jonathan, I instructed, taking a slow sip of the freezing water. I want it to feel substantial. I want it to make a very loud thud when I drop it on the table. And Jonathan. Yes, Miss Sterling. Draft a non-disclosure agreement, a brutal, suffocating contract. When I present Chloe with the evidence of her federal crimes, I am going to offer her a singular, terrifying choice. She will sign over complete access to that Cayman Island account, relinquishing every stolen dime back into my private holding company, or I will personally hand-deliver the dossier to the FBI lead investigator. I want her completely stripped of her stolen wealth and entirely trapped in the resulting fallout of her husband's impending federal indictment. She wanted to play the corporate game. It is time she learned what a hostile takeover actually looks like. Understood, Miss Sterling. The documents will be flawless. I disconnected the line and let the absolute silence of the penthouse embrace me. The Atlanta sun was bright and scorching, casting a brilliant glare over the city. I had 72 hours until the trap violently snapped shut. I had never felt more alive. The next 48 hours blurred into a symphony of ruthless corporate efficiency. Wednesday morning broke over the Atlanta skyline, not with the gentle warmth of a sunrise, but with the harsh, blinding glare of a conqueror's dawn. The perspective of the room shifted rapidly, the visual focus circling my expansive mahogany desk in a swift, dizzying orbit. I stood at the center of this dynamic swirl of activity, a solid, unmoving pillar of absolute authority. Spread across the dark, polished grain of the wood were hundreds of pages of dense legal text. Jonathan had outdone himself. He had arrived precisely at 6 a.m, flanked by 2 senior paralegals carrying heavy locked briefcases that contained the complete financial anatomy of my biological family. I picked up my customized titanium fountain pen. The cool, heavy metal felt perfectly balanced between my fingers. I did not hesitate. My hand moved across the signature lines with fluid, aggressive speed. The scratch of the gold nib against the heavy premium paper was the only sound in the penthouse, a sharp, rhythmic ticking that mirrored the ticking of a bomb. Document after document was signed, notarized, and instantly finalized. I was not just signing my name. I was executing a masterclass in counter-corporate warfare. I was binding their miserable fates to my holding company with chains forged from their own spectacular greed. The banks and lending institutions had been practically weeping with gratitude when Jonathan's team approached them. Financial institutions loathe toxic debt. Desmond and Vivian's 3 separate mortgages on the Alpharetta mansion were a glaring liability on the books of the primary lender. The property was severely underwater, and the foreclosure process is notoriously expensive and time-consuming. When my shadow corporation offered to purchase the non-performing notes, the bank immediately authorized the transfer. I bought their debt for literal pennies on the dollar, but the purchase price was irrelevant. By legally acquiring those mortgages, I assumed the full weight of the original contracts. I absorbed every predatory interest rate, every missed penalty fee, and every single clause of default. I was now the sole legal owner of the ground my parents walked on. I owned the roof over their heads. I held the absolute unquestionable right to evict them onto the street with a single phone call. My pen moved to the next stack of folders. These were significantly darker. These were DeAndre's promissory notes. Finding the shadow lenders who had fronted him the $10 million was supposed to be difficult, but desperate criminals are remarkably easy to locate when you know exactly which rocks to overturn. They were nervous about the FBI chatter surrounding DeAndre's boutique firm. Criminal syndicates prefer to operate in the dark, and DeAndre's sloppy federal wire fraud was drawing entirely too much heat. When my intermediaries offered to buy out DeAndre's markers at a premium, they surrendered the paper immediately, eager to distance themselves from a man who was clearly walking into a federal trap. I signed the final transfer agreement and dropped the pen. The ink dried quickly, sinking into the page and sealing the absolute reality of my victory. I did not call the police. I did not alert the authorities. A lesser strategist would have immediately contacted the federal prosecutors and handed over the evidence of DeAndre's massive mortgage fraud and Chloe's offshore embezzlement scheme. It would have been the easiest route. It would have instantly removed them from my life and sent them straight to federal prison. But that would have been a profound waste of leverage. That would have robbed me of the exquisite personal satisfaction of dropping the guillotine myself. Reporting them to the FBI would make me merely a witness to their destruction. I did not want to be a witness. I wanted to be the architect. I wanted to look into their eyes and watch the exact terrifying moment they realized that the daughter they discarded had systematically purchased their entire existence. I wanted them to understand that their freedom, their home, and their financial survival were no longer up to a judge or a jury. Their fate rested entirely in the palm of my hand. The federal agents could have them eventually. The Justice Department would inevitably tear DeAndre's fake empire to the ground. But before the government took their pound of flesh, I was going to collect my absolute due. I was going to execute a flawless emotional and financial payoff. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the crawling traffic of the financial district. My biological family had demanded a ransom. They thought they had cornered a vulnerable target. Instead, they had unknowingly handed me the keys to their kingdom. They believed they were hunting a gazelle, but they had wandered blindly into a lion's den holding a broken stick. They were completely unaware that the money they were trying to steal from me was currently being used to buy the very air they were breathing. The trap was now fully constructed. There were no loose ends. There were no overlooked variables. Jonathan had organized the signed documents into 3 separate, sleek black leather folders. The first folder contained the deed and the immediate foreclosure notices for the Alpharetta mansion. The second folder held the transferred promissory notes, making me DeAndre's sole and absolute creditor. The third folder, the thickest and most devastating of them all, contained the complete forensic breakdown of Chloe's Cayman Island, accounts her brother's fake Delaware shell company, and the brutal non-disclosure agreement that would strip her of her stolen millions. I ran my hand lightly over the smooth leather of the folders. They were cold to the touch, but they radiated immense absolute power. I was no longer the frightened 12-year-old girl shivering in the back of a social worker's sedan. I was no longer the unwanted spare part, the family embarrassment, or the convenient target. I was Elias Sterling's protégé. I was the apex predator of the Atlanta real estate market, and as of this exact moment, I was the undisputed master of their entire legacy. I instructed Jonathan to prepare the main boardroom on the penthouse level for Friday morning. I did not want them sitting comfortably in my living room again. I wanted them in a sterile corporate environment. I wanted the acoustics to reflect the harsh reality of the business transaction they were about to endure. I ordered the security team to allow them uninterrupted access to the private elevator at exactly 9 o'clock. They would arrive dressed in their finest counterfeit power suits, projecting unearned arrogance and demanding their $10 million check. They would bring their forged psychiatric evaluation, believing it was the ultimate weapon. They would walk into the room expecting a surrender. I was going to give them a massacre. I returned to my desk and neatly aligned the 3 black folders perfectly parallel to the edge of the mahogany. I poured a glass of sparkling water, letting the condensation chill my fingers. The meticulous preparation was complete. Every legal loophole was closed. Every financial escape route was heavily barricaded. I had officially executed the most comprehensive hostile counter-takeover of my entire professional career, and I had done it without breaking a single sweat. I looked at the digital clock glowing on the corner of my terminal. The countdown was almost over. The final act was approaching with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train, and I was sitting calmly in the driver's seat waiting for the collision. The heavy gilded doors of the Buckhead Elite Country Club swung open before me, yielding to the aggressive, blinding flashes of event photography. The warm, incandescent glow of cascading crystal chandeliers spilled out into the humid Atlanta night, cutting through the darkness. I stepped over the marble threshold, and the ambient noise of the grand foyer instantly swelled around me. My heels clicked with lethal rhythmic precision against the polished stone as I moved past the velvet ropes. I wore a custom-structured gown in deep midnight crimson silk. It was not merely a dress. It was bespoke armor masquerading as high fashion designed to command absolute authority in a room completely suffocated by artificial prestige. Thursday evening had officially arrived. This was Desmond's grand 30-year corporate anniversary gala. To the oblivious local media and the smiling socialites filling the room, it was a celebration of a local business titan. In reality, it was a desperate, glamorous masquerade engineered to extract emergency capital from wealthy Marks before his financial house of cards violently collapsed. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos navigated the crowded ballroom carrying silver trays stacked with vintage champagne and imported caviar. The room was a suffocating sea of tailored bespoke suits and heavily insured, borrowed diamonds. I observed the crowd with the serene, terrifying detachment of a ghost haunting a rapidly sinking ship. Tomorrow morning, Desmond, Vivian, and DeAndre would march confidently into my penthouse to demand their $10 million ransom. Tonight, they were performing their final elaborate swan song. I moved smoothly through the perimeter of the room, letting the sheer audacity of their public charade wash over me. Desmond was holding court near a massive carved ice sculpture, projecting the booming, jovial confidence of a self-made king. He was aggressively pitching his phantom success to a group of elderly venture capitalists, completely unaware that the daughter walking silently behind him was currently his sole legal creditor. Before I could reach the center of the grand ballroom, the welcoming committee intercepted my path. Vivian and Chloe materialized from the dense crowd like a pair of highly coordinated predatory birds swooping in to protect their territory. Vivian wore an overly embellished silver gown that screamed of frantic, maxed-out credit limits, while Chloe stood beside her clutching a new, authentic Birkin bag, undoubtedly financed by her latest fraudulent wire transfer to the Cayman Islands. Vivian's face stretched into a tight, Botox-frozen smile as she lunged forward to plant 2 dry, aggressive air kisses an inch away from my cheeks. The cloying scent of her heavy floral perfume completely failed to mask the unmistakable stench of her quiet desperation. "Nia, darling." Vivian crooned, her voice artificially amplified to ensure the surrounding wealthy guests could hear her performative maternal affection. "We were positively certain you would be too intimidated by the sheer scale of this event to actually show up. I am so incredibly glad you decided to step out of your little shell tonight." Chloe offered a patronizing tilt of her perfectly styled head, letting her eyes drag up and down my crimson gown with calculated disdain. It is a lovely attempt, Nia. Chloe added her tone dripping with toxic, rehearsed sweetness. It is always so brave when you try to blend in with this tier of society. We know how much you absolutely struggle with high-pressure corporate environments. Just try not to overwhelm anyone tonight. It is a very exclusive guest list. I did not flinch. I did not react with anger or defense. I simply smiled, letting the icy calm of absolute total power radiate from my posture. Their words were hollow rubber bullets bouncing harmlessly off a titanium vault. Since you did not properly RSVP, we had to make some very hasty last-minute adjustments to the seating chart. Vivian explained, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, specifically engineered to humiliate me. We placed you at table 42. It is just past the kitchen swing doors, sitting with Cousin Greg and the junior accounting staff. I know you prefer to be tucked away where you will not feel out of place among your father's actual elite peers. Do try to keep your voice down when the speeches begin, so the waitstaff can hear the orders. A group of Desmond's potential investors, including a prominent local banking executive, turned their attention toward our little reunion. Vivian immediately seized the golden opportunity to establish her social dominance in front of a captive audience. Charles, she called out, waving the silver-haired executive over to our circle. I want you to meet my youngest daughter, Nia. She dabbles in residential properties downtown. Nothing at all like DeAndre's massive federal development firm, of course, but we always encourage her little projects. We believe it is so important to keep her busy and out of trouble. Chloe stepped closer, deliberately linking her arm through Vivian's in a manufactured display of absolute family solidarity. We are just hoping she eventually learns the ropes, Charles. Chloe chimed in, flashing her bright counterfeit smile at the banker. DeAndre has generously offered to mentor her, but she is terribly stubborn. We are just praying she does not sink her modest little savings into a bad market. It is so hard for young women to grasp the complex mechanics of high-level finance without a strong, successful man to guide them. The banking executive offered me a polite, pitying smile, completely buying into their meticulously crafted narrative of the struggling, incompetent daughter. He nodded sympathetically at Vivian, loudly praising her for her endless maternal patience and generosity. I stood perfectly still. The sheer magnificent irony of the moment was almost too delicious to consume. Chloe was publicly mocking my financial literacy, while I had a 300-page dossier sitting on my desk, proving she was an international money launderer. Vivian was bragging about DeAndre's elite firm while I literally owned the overdue defaulted mortgages on the very bed she would sleep in tonight. I did not break character. I leaned slightly forward, catching Chloe's gaze with eyes as hard and unreadable as polished obsidian. You are absolutely right, Chloe. I said, my voice a low, smooth purr that cut effortlessly through the ambient noise of the ballroom. High-level finance is an incredibly complex game. It requires total, absolute transparency. The moment you start hiding phantom assets or moving unauthorized capital across international borders, the entire foundation rots from the inside out. One simple forensic audit and the whole illusion shatters. Do you not agree? Chloe's smile faltered for a microscopic fraction of a second. A brief flash of genuine, unfiltered panic twitched behind her perfectly mascaraed eyes. The subtle, pointed reference to hidden borders and unauthorized capital had brushed dangerously close to her Cayman Islands secret. She recovered quickly, letting out a high-pitched, dismissive laugh, but her grip on the designer bag tightened until her knuckles turned bone white. Vivian, completely oblivious to the lethal undercurrent of the exchange, simply patted my arm with extreme condescension. Oh, Nia, let us leave the complex economic theories to your brother and your father. Vivian sighed, turning her back to me and addressing the banking executive. Go find your seat, dear. Try not to bump into the waitstaff on your way to the back. Desmond chose that exact moment to join the circle, wrapping a heavy, possessive arm around Vivian's waist. He puffed his chest out, looking at me with absolute disdain. Glad you could make it to see what real success looks like, he boomed, his voice echoing with fraudulent pride. Pay close attention tonight, Nia. You might actually learn how empires are built. I offered them one final devastatingly serene smile. "I will be paying very close attention, Desmond," I promised softly. "Enjoy your evening." I turned on my heel and walked away. I did not walk toward table 42. I did not retreat to the shadows near the kitchen doors to sit with the junior accountants. I bypassed the crowded dining floor completely. I walked directly toward the private VIP lounge area on the mezzanine level, a secluded space overlooking the entire grand ballroom. I bypassed the velvet rope, flashing a look at the security guard who instantly stepped aside, recognizing the subtle, unyielding aura of someone who owned the very air in the room. I stood at the glass balcony looking down at the glittering, fraudulent spectacle below. I watched Desmond shake hands with men he intended to defraud. I watched Vivian parade around the room dripping in jewelry financed by secondary mortgages she could no longer afford to pay. I watched Chloe nervously check her phone, likely monitoring the offshore accounts that Jonathan had already frozen hours ago. Tomorrow morning, the sun would rise and the final curtain would fall on their delusion. They would march into my penthouse expecting a surrender, and I would personally hand them the instruments of their absolute ruin. But tonight I would let them drink their vintage champagne. I would let Desmond give his boasting, empty speeches. I would let Vivian pretend she was a queen and let Chloe pretend she was an untouchable mastermind. I watched them from the elevated mezzanine, sipping my own glass of sparkling water. The higher they built their desperate, glittering pedestal tonight, the more violent and spectacular their impact would be when I shattered the floor beneath them tomorrow. The hunt was over, and they were simply dancing in the crosshairs. The chime of a silver spoon tapping against crystal cut sharply through the ambient hum of the grand ballroom. The sound echoed through the state-of-the-art acoustic system, instantly commanding the attention of the 400 affluent guests. I stepped back from the glass balcony of the mezzanine and made my descent just as the heavy house lights began to dim. The time for passive observation had passed. If I was going to be the featured attraction in their elaborate theater, I needed to be in my designated seat when the curtain rose. I navigated the dark perimeter of the ballroom, moving with silent, fluid grace, until I reached table 42. It was exactly where Vivian had promised. It was a poorly positioned table, practically wedged against the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen, completely isolated from the vibrant center of the room. The junior accountants and distant relatives seated there shifted uncomfortably as I took my chair, deliberately avoiding my gaze. I sat with perfect posture, folding my hands over my crimson silk lap. As my eyes adjusted to the dramatic spotlight illuminating the main stage, I could feel the subtle, hostile shifts in the room. The crowd was a living, breathing organism, and its collective attention was slowly, aggressively turning toward me. Vivian and Chloe had clearly spent the last hour systematically poisoning the well. They had fluttered from table to table, planting seeds of toxic gossip and painting me as the unstable, jealous outcast. The whispers rippled through the surrounding tables like a sudden cold draft. I felt the heavy physical weight of their scrutiny. I saw the condescending pity, the blatant contempt, and the disguised amusement on the faces of the elite guests as they threw covert glances over their shoulders. They looked at me and saw a socially unfit black sheep relegated to the shadows. I looked back at them and saw a room full of unwitting accomplices standing in the blast radius of a bomb. Desmond strode to the center of the stage. He looked every inch the powerful statesman in his bespoke tuxedo, projecting an aura of invincibility that completely defied the reality of his massive impending defaults. He gripped the edges of the acrylic podium and leaned into the microphone. A hush fell over the magnificent room. 30 years, he began, his voice a rich, booming baritone that instantly captivated the audience. 30 years ago, I started this journey with nothing but a vision and the unwavering support of my beautiful wife, Vivian. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Vivian, seated at the center VIP table directly in front of the stage, offered a demure, practiced wave. Desmond raised a hand, calling for silence. He masterfully spun a tale of corporate resilience, of overcoming impossible odds, and of building a legacy that would stand the test of time. It was a brilliant, captivating performance. He knew exactly how to play the room, how to stroke the egos of the venture capitalists, and how to command the respect of his peers. But as his speech neared its climax, his tone dramatically shifted. The booming confidence melted away, replaced by a sudden, masterful display of vulnerability. But building an empire comes with a heavy personal cost. Desmond continued, his voice dropping to a somber, intimate register. It demands sacrifice. It demands late nights, missed birthdays, and sometimes it creates painful fractures within the very family you are working so hard to provide for. He paused, pulling a pristine white linen handkerchief from his pocket and dabbing at his eyes. It was a spectacular piece of acting. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, completely entranced by his display of raw emotion. "We have faced incredible challenges recently," Desmond confessed, his voice cracking with perfect theatrical precision. "The market has been unforgiving, and I will admit to you all tonight that our legacy was facing a precipitous edge. But God is good. God works in mysterious, beautiful ways. He teaches us about grace, and He teaches us about the profound, unbreakable power of forgiveness." I watched Chloe lean forward at the VIP table, her eyes shining with fake tears as she gripped DeAndre's hand. The trap was opening. "Tonight is not just an anniversary," Desmond declared, his voice rising in volume and power. "Tonight is a resurrection. When we were at our lowest point, a miracle occurred. A heart was softened. A prodigal daughter returned to the fold." Desmond threw his arm out, pointing directly toward the back of the ballroom. The lighting technician, perfectly synchronized with the cue, swung a massive, blinding spotlight across the ceiling. The brilliant white beam cut through the darkness and slammed directly into table 42. I was instantly bathed in a blinding, unforgiving circle of light. Hundreds of heads swiveled in unison, staring directly at me. "Ladies and gentlemen," Desmond boomed, his voice echoing with triumphant religious fervor, "I want to publicly recognize my youngest daughter, Nia. She has stepped forward out of the shadows to prove that blood is thicker than any misunderstanding. Tonight, she has been touched by grace and has committed a $10 million capital injection to save our family business and propel our legacy into the next century." The ballroom erupted. It was a deafening, thunderous roar of applause. The heavy, oppressive weight of their collective approval crashed down on me. The venture capitalists nodded with profound respect. The socialites wiped away performative tears. DeAndre stood up from his front row seat, raising his champagne glass high in the air, while Chloe clapped enthusiastically, her face twisted into a mask of pure, venomous triumph. It was a stroke of absolute manipulative genius. They had backed me into the ultimate psychological corner. They had weaponized the entire room, using the sheer crushing force of public expectation to legally and socially extort my assets. They knew that in the elite echelons of Atlanta, high society reputation is currency. They genuinely believed that a woman of my standing, protecting a pristine corporate image, would never dare to cause a messy public scene. They thought the immense peer pressure would paralyze me. They calculated that I would be forced to smile, nod, and silently surrender the $10 million just to avoid the catastrophic humiliation of a public family war. They thought they had placed a social gun to my head and given me absolutely no choice but to pull the trigger myself. I remained seated for exactly 5 seconds. I let the deafening applause wash over me. I let the blinding heat of the spotlight illuminate the calm, terrifying serenity on my face. I did not panic. I did not shrink away. The deep crimson silk of my gown seemed to absorb the harsh light, transforming me from a target into a warning. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the submissive hesitation they expected. The applause began to slightly falter, replaced by a sudden ripple of confusion as I stepped away from table 42. I did not smile. I did not offer a gracious wave. I simply began to walk. My heels clicked against the marble floor with lethal, rhythmic precision. The crowd parted before me, creating a narrow corridor through the sea of expensive suits and glittering gowns. As I moved past the tables, the murmurs died in my wake. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. I walked past the venture capitalists. I walked past the banking executives. I kept my eyes locked dead center on Desmond, whose triumphant smile was beginning to show microscopic fractures of uncertainty. Vivian stood up at the VIP table, her hands clutching her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with sudden, unspoken panic. She had expected me to wave from the back of the room. She had not expected me to approach the stage. Chloe dropped her hands, her clapping abruptly ceasing as I glided past her table. The air around me was electric, crackling with the violent, terrifying energy of a storm about to break. I was not walking to my slaughter. I was walking to the executioner's block, and I was holding the axe. I reached the short flight of stairs leading up to the main stage. Desmond gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white as he stared down at me. The microphone picked up his sudden, shallow intake of breath, amplifying it through the silent ballroom. He tried to project a welcoming smile, but it looked more like a grimace of terror. He stepped back instinctively, yielding the space as I ascended the stairs and took my place directly behind the acrylic podium. I looked out over the vast sea of faces, over the hundreds of people who had just been manipulated into applauding my extortion. I adjusted the microphone, pulling it a fraction of an inch closer to my mouth. The resulting feedback was a sharp, high-pitched whine that made several guests in the front row flinch. I looked down at Desmond, who was now standing awkwardly to my left, and then I looked directly at Chloe and Vivian in the front row. They thought they had orchestrated a public humiliation. They had absolutely no idea that they had simply built me the perfect stage to burn their entire world to the ground. I gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, letting the cool synthetic material ground me. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. 400 of Atlanta's most elite investors, politicians, and socialites stared up at me, their faces illuminated by the ambient glow of the stage lights. They were waiting for the heartwarming climax of Desmond's manufactured redemption story. They were waiting for the prodigal daughter to hand over a golden ticket. Desmond shifted his weight beside me, leaning in so close I could smell the stale scotch on his breath. "Give them the envelope, Nia," he muttered, his voice a low, frantic growl meant only for my ears. "Smile for the cameras and hand over the check. Do not embarrass us tonight." I turned my head slowly, meeting his desperate, sweating gaze. I did not smile. I did not reach for my clutch. I simply leaned forward, bringing my lips a fraction of an inch from the microphone. "Good evening, everyone." My voice washed over the vast room, smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of the trembling hesitation my family had anticipated. I want to thank Desmond for that breathtaking introduction. It was a masterful performance. He spoke eloquently about 30 years of building an empire. He spoke of sacrifice, of legacy, and of the profound, unbreakable bonds of family. He told you that I have stepped out of the shadows tonight to deliver a $10 million capital injection to save this business. I paused, letting the words hang in the silent air. I looked down at the VIP table. Vivian was clutching her linen napkin, her knuckles white, her Botox frozen face twitching with early signs of panic. Beside her, Chloe was perfectly still, her eyes locked on me with the terrifying realization of a trapped animal. DeAndre was frowning, his champagne glass half raised to his mouth. "It is a beautiful story," I continued, my tone dropping into a colder, lethal register. "But like everything else in Desmond's life, it is a complete and total fabrication." A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the ballroom. The polite smiles on the faces of the venture capitalists instantly vanished, replaced by sharp, calculating confusion. Desmond lunged forward, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson, but he was too late. I had already raised my right hand, giving a swift, precise signal to the sound booth at the back of the room. Jonathan had been waiting for this exact moment. The massive digital screen behind the stage, which had been projecting a glittering gold 30-year anniversary logo, suddenly flickered and went entirely black. A second later, it violently flared back to life, illuminating the entire stage in a harsh, glaring white light. There were no family portraits on the screen. There were no graphs depicting imaginary corporate growth. Instead, the massive display was filled with high-resolution scans of heavily redacted legal documents. The text was stark and undeniable, stamped with glaring red ink that read, "Notice of default asset forfeiture and transfer of deed." The sheer scale of the documents, magnified 20 times their normal size, loomed over Desmond like a digital Grim Reaper. "I did not bring a $10 million check tonight," I announced, my voice slicing through the rising murmurs of the crowd like a surgical scalpel. "I brought a formal decree of liquidation." Desmond physically stumbled backward, his eyes darting wildly between the giant screen and the faces of his investors. He opened his mouth to speak, to shout for security to cut the microphone, but no sound came out. The absolute shock had paralyzed his vocal cords. I turned my attention directly to the banking executives seated in the front rows. "For the past hour, you have been listening to a man desperate to secure your capital, to plug a hemorrhaging hole in his accounts. He told you his firm was facing a temporary hurdle. That was a lie. As of 8 o'clock this morning, this corporate entity ceased to possess any functional equity. They are entirely bankrupt. They are drowning in toxic debt, and their primary lenders were preparing to initiate federal bankruptcy proceedings by Monday morning." The murmurs in the crowd erupted into loud, chaotic whispers. Cell phones were suddenly appearing as investors frantically began texting their own risk management teams. I did not let the momentum fade. I kept my voice perfectly measured, dominating the room with absolute authority. "I did not come here tonight to save my father's legacy," I stated, looking directly down at Vivian, who was now openly trembling in her seat. "I came here to purchase it. I am the shadow corporation that bought out every single one of your non-performing notes. I purchased your toxic debt from your lenders for pennies on the dollar. Every bank, every shadow lender, every desperate creditor you owe money to has legally transferred their rights to me." I pointed up at the massive screen where a new document materialized. It was the deed to the Alpharetta mansion, stamped with a bold red foreclosure notice. "Vivian, you spent the evening bragging about your exclusive lifestyle while mocking my lack of pedigree," I said, my voice chilling the very air in the room. "But you forgot to mention the 3 underwater mortgages you took out on your home to finance your jewelry collection. You forgot to mention that you have missed 6 consecutive payments. As the sole owner of that debt, I initiated the foreclosure protocols this afternoon. That beautiful estate no longer belongs to you. By Monday, you will be legally evicted from the property. You are completely and officially homeless." Vivian let out a strangled, horrified gasp, pressing both hands over her mouth as tears of pure, unadulterated terror spilled over her carefully applied makeup. She collapsed back into her chair, the heavy silver gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume. DeAndre leaped to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the marble floor. "Shut the microphone off," he screamed, his voice cracking with rage as he pointed a shaking finger at the sound booth. "She is lying. This is a stunt. Cut the audio right now." I did not even blink. I signaled Jonathan again. The screen instantly changed, flashing DeAndre's personal promissory notes, the markers he had given to the criminal syndicates to fund his fraudulent mortgage scheme. The signatures were clearly visible, magnified for every single person in the room to verify. "Sit down, DeAndre," I commanded, my voice echoing with the crack of a whip. "Your golden boy facade is over. You borrowed $10 million from domestic syndicates to fund your phantom developments. You committed rampant federal wire fraud, and then you funneled the stolen capital into luxury cars and country club dues. I bought your debt too. Every single marker you owe is now payable directly to me. I own your firm. I own your assets. I own every single dime you will ever make for the rest of your miserable life." DeAndre's face drained of all color. The arrogant sneer he had worn his entire life melted into an expression of absolute, profound dread. He looked at the screen, realizing that the dangerous men he owed money to had sold him out to his own sister. He slowly sank back into his chair, his hands gripping his head as the reality of his total financial destruction crushed him. The ballroom was an absolute pandemonium. Investors were standing up, throwing their napkins onto the tables, their faces twisted in outrage. The banking executive Vivian had tried to impress earlier was staring at Desmond with pure, unadulterated disgust. They realized they had been invited to a slaughterhouse disguised as a gala. They had been mere inches away from handing millions of dollars to a family of sophisticated con artists. I turned back to Desmond. He was shaking visibly, gripping the podium to keep his knees from buckling. The powerful self-made titan had been entirely stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, terrified old man staring into the abyss of his own making. "You called me up here to use me, Desmond?" I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper that reverberated through the silent microphones. "You thought you could use the social pressure of this room to force me into writing a check. You thought the threat of public humiliation would break me. But you failed to understand one fundamental truth. I am not the frightened little girl you cast aside. I am the predator you carelessly invited into your home." I stepped away from the podium. The harsh white spotlight followed me, casting a long, sharp shadow across the stage. I looked down at Chloe, who was hyperventilating at the VIP table, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her counterfeit designer bag. "I have one final piece of business to conclude tomorrow morning," I announced, addressing the entire room but looking solely at my sister-in-law. "But as for tonight, this 30-year anniversary celebration is officially over. The company is liquidated. The assets are seized. The legacy is dead." I did not wait for security. I did not wait for the inevitable shouting to resume. I turned my back on my biological family, leaving them trapped in the blinding glare of the stage lights, surrounded by the irrefutable projected evidence of their total ruin. I walked down the stairs and straight through the center of the ballroom. The crowd of elite investors and socialites parted instantly, respectfully, clearing a wide path for me to exit. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody tried to stop me. They simply watched in stunned absolute silence as the true architect of the evening walked out of the Buckhead Elite Country Club, leaving the ashes of Desmond's empire smoldering on the floor behind me. I was halfway across the expansive marble floor when the paralyzing shock holding the room hostage finally shattered. A guttural roar of pure, unhinged fury ripped through the elegant space. DeAndre, propelled by a volatile cocktail of public humiliation and desperate rage, vaulted off the stage. He shoved past a cluster of terrified socialites, sending a tray of champagne flutes crashing to the floor in a shower of shattered crystal and spilled wine. The entire perspective of the room seemed to violently tilt, throwing the meticulously curated gala into absolute chaos. He lunged into my path, physically blocking the grand exit. His face was contorted into an ugly mask of desperation, veins bulging against his neck as his perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket strained against his erratic movements. He pointed a trembling finger mere inches from my face. "You parasite!" He spat, saliva flying from his lips as his voice cracked with hysteria. "You miserable, jealous traitor! We gave you everything. We let you into our world and you try to ruin us. You are trying to destroy your own flesh and blood because you could never measure up to this family. You are a cancer, Nia. You are a bitter, pathetic outcast, and you are destroying our entire legacy out of pure spite." The surrounding guests recoiled, pulling back to avoid the blast zone. The banking executives and venture capitalists watched with wide, unblinking eyes, captivated by the catastrophic implosion of the Sterling dynasty. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I met his manic stare with eyes like absolute zero. I raised my hand, holding a small matte black presentation remote that Jonathan had slipped into my palm before the gala. I did not even look back at the stage. I simply pressed the button. The massive digital screen behind Desmond shifted one final time. The stark foreclosure notices vanished, replaced by a highly detailed high-contrast display of federal indictments, wire transfer logs, and heavily stamped Department of Justice seals. "No, DeAndre," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, frigid calm that sliced right through his screaming hysteria. "I did not destroy this family. Your staggering ignorance and your reckless federal mortgage fraud destroyed this family. I am simply the one organizing the wreckage." I raised my voice just enough to ensure the wealthiest investors in the front rows heard every single syllable. "You thought you were a genius playing a high-stakes game with federal loans. You created phantom properties, forged appraisal documents, and funneled millions of dollars of government-backed funds directly into your personal lifestyle accounts to fund your pathetic illusion of grandeur. You did not build a real estate empire. You built a federally mandated prison sentence. And you were so incredibly arrogant, so blinded by your own unearned privilege, that you did not even realize the FBI had tapped your corporate lines 6 months ago. As if my words had summoned the wrath of the heavens themselves, the distant wail of sirens pierced the humid Atlanta night. The sound grew rapidly louder, multiplying in volume and intensity, until it drowned out the frantic whispers of the 400 guests. Through the towering glass windows of the country club, blinding flashes of red and blue light violently painted the manicured lawns, bleeding into the ballroom and competing with the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers. The heavy gilded doors of the grand foyer were shoved open, not by polite valets, but by a dozen armed federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with FBI emblazoned in bold yellow letters across their backs. They moved with absolute tactical precision, a relentless wave of strict governmental authority pouring into the room and entirely ignoring the gasps and screams of the city's most elite citizens. The lead agent, a tall, formidable man with a face carved from granite, walked straight past me and stepped directly into DeAndre's personal space. DeAndre Sterling, the agent, announced, his voice devoid of any emotion, ringing out with absolute finality. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering." DeAndre completely froze. His false bravado, his screaming rage, and his arrogant posturing evaporated instantly into the cold air. The golden boy of the family, the undisputed prince of Atlanta real estate, was suddenly reduced to a trembling, terrified shell. He looked frantically toward the stage, seeking his father, seeking a bailout, seeking someone to write a check to make the bad men go away. Desmond was completely paralyzed. He was gripping the edges of the acrylic podium as if it were a life raft in a hurricane, his face ashen, his jaw slack. The great corporate titan offered his favorite son absolutely nothing. Vivian let out a piercing theatrical shriek, dropping to her knees and clawing at the heavy stage curtains. She wept loudly, screaming about a mistake, but she made no move to actually approach the armed federal agents surrounding her beloved boy. "Put your hands behind your back," the agent commanded, seizing DeAndre's arm with brutal efficiency. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around DeAndre's wrists echoed through the silent ballroom. It was the definitive, unmistakable sound of an empire collapsing. The agents turned him around, marching him roughly toward the exit. He dragged his feet, his head hung low in absolute supreme humiliation. He was forced to do a perp walk right through the center of the very crowd he had spent his entire life trying to impress. I stood perfectly still, watching the men who had once applauded him turn their backs in utter disgust. The banking executive Vivian had tried to leverage against me earlier was furiously typing on his phone, ordering his team to sever any remaining ties with the Sterling name. The socialites who had fawned over DeAndre's luxury cars now covered their mouths, whispering terribly cruel things as he was paraded past their tables in federal chains. I stepped aside, allowing the FBI escort to pass. I watched DeAndre being shoved through the gilded doors, the flashing red and blue lights swallowing him whole into the dark reality of the justice system. I turned my head slightly, casting one final glance toward the VIP section. Chloe was sitting completely motionless at the front table. She was staring blankly at the empty space where her husband had just been standing. She knew exactly what this meant. She knew her Cayman Island accounts were frozen. She knew her fraudulent transfers, her fake consulting invoices, and her offshore hoarding were thoroughly documented in the thick black folders currently resting on my penthouse desk. She knew the federal agents taking her husband away were going to tear their entire financial existence down to the studs. Her perfect, pristine mask of superiority had melted away entirely. She looked directly at me, her eyes wide with a silent, suffocating terror. She finally understood the magnitude of the predator she had tried to patronize. I offered her a very slow, very deliberate nod, acknowledging her silent panic. Tomorrow morning was going to be a bloodbath, and she was already bleeding out. I adjusted the strap of my clutch, turning my back on the wreckage I had orchestrated. I walked out of the Buckhead Elite Country Club, stepping into the cool, refreshing night air. The gala was over. The golden boy was gone. The family legacy was reduced to a pile of toxic debt and federal indictments, and I had a 9 o'clock meeting to prepare for. Friday morning arrived precisely on schedule, and my penthouse boardroom was a temple of clinical corporate execution. The long glass conference table was spotless, reflecting the pale morning light pouring in from the floor-to-ceiling windows. At exactly 8:50, Jonathan and his legal team took their positions, standing silently along the perimeter of the room like a row of highly paid executioners. I sat at the head of the table wearing a pristine white tailored suit that offered a sharp, glaring contrast to the absolute darkness of the reality I was about to unleash. At 9 o'clock sharp, the private elevator chimed. The heavy steel doors slid open, and the remnants of the Sterling Empire spilled out into my foyer. Desmond and Vivian walked like ghosts. The arrogant titan and the boastful matriarch from the previous night had been entirely hollowed out. Desmond's shoulders were slumped, his suit looking suddenly 2 sizes too big. Vivian was openly weeping, clutching a crumpled tissue, her eyes swollen and darting around the room in absolute terror. They had spent the entire night watching their golden boy get processed into federal custody and waking up to the indisputable reality that they no longer owned the roof over their heads. But Chloe was a different story entirely. She marched out of the elevator radiating a frantic, indignant energy. She was not crying. She was practically vibrating with rage. She wore a severe black dress, clutching her counterfeit Birkin bag like a shield. She stepped past Desmond and Vivian, aggressively separating herself from their misery, and marched directly up to the glass conference table. She slammed the heavy bag down onto the pristine glass surface. The sharp crack echoed through the silent room, drawing everyone's attention to the cheap, fraying stitching on the leather handles, before my gaze slowly, meticulously traveled up to lock onto her face. The blood had entirely drained from her cheeks, leaving her pale and drawn, but her eyes were wild with a desperate, entitled fury. "You have completely destroyed my life, Nia!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "I hope you are satisfied with your sick little power trip. I am filing for divorce from DeAndre this exact minute. He is a fraud and a criminal, and I refuse to spend another second attached to this miserable, sinking ship of a family." Desmond let out a weak, wounded groan at her words, but Chloe completely ignored him, her venom directed entirely at me. "My family has a pristine reputation." "Nia," she spat, her tone dripping with the toxic, unearned superiority she had wielded against me since the day we met. "We come from a noble, respected lineage. We are hard-working, honest people. I will not allow my good name to be dragged through the mud because your brother is an incompetent federal criminal. My lawyers are drafting a lawsuit against this estate for severe emotional distress and public humiliation. You orchestrated that entire spectacle last night just to embarrass me. I am leaving this nightmare, and I am taking whatever I am owed to rebuild the life your family ruined." The silence that followed her tirade was heavy and absolute. I looked at her flushed face, at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her performance. She genuinely believed her own lie. She believed her manufactured innocence and her privileged background made her completely untouchable. She thought she could just cut the cord, grab her golden parachute, and parachute away from the wreckage while playing the victim. I leaned back in my leather chair, and then I laughed. It was not a soft chuckle. It was a loud, booming, genuinely amused laugh that bounced off the boardroom walls. The sheer, predatory joy in my voice made Vivian flinch and caused Desmond to step backward. Chloe stopped breathing, her chest heaving as she stared at me, her indignant rage faltering against the wall of my absolute amusement. "You are going to rebuild your life, Chloe?" I asked, wiping a single tear of mirth from my eye. "With what money exactly?" Her jaw tightened. "I am entitled to half of his remaining marital assets. I am his wife." I stopped laughing. The temperature in the room instantly dropped to absolute zero. "Do not rush toward the exit just yet, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping into a lethal, quiet hum. "Because you are not going anywhere. You think you are the smartest person in the room. You think you can stand in my home, invoke your noble, pristine family lineage, and threaten me with a lawsuit while you have $3 million of stolen capital sitting in a Cayman Island offshore account." The color did not just drain from Chloe's face, it completely vanished. She looked as though she had been physically struck. Her perfectly curated mask of superiority violently shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Her mouth opened, but she could not force a single syllable past her paralyzed vocal cords. I gestured to Jonathan, who stepped forward and dropped a thick, heavy black folder directly onto the glass table next to her counterfeit bag. "Did you honestly think I did not know?" I asked, watching her eyes lock onto the dossier with absolute horror. "Did you think your little shell company in Delaware was clever? Bradley Jenkins, your brother, the same brother who comes from your noble, honest lineage, is currently listed as the registered agent for a phantom consulting firm that has been systematically siphoning 20% of DeAndre's federal loan money for the past 14 months. Desmond's head snapped up. He looked at Chloe and then at the folder, his exhausted brain struggling to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Vivian gasped, gripping the back of a chair for support. "She has been bleeding him dry." "Desmond," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Chloe's terrified face, "your brilliant, perfect daughter-in-law knew DeAndre's company was a fraud. Instead of stopping him, she set up recurring ghost invoices. Every time he secured a fraudulent mortgage, she instantly diverted the cash to Delaware and wired it straight to the Caymans. She stole $3.2 million right from under his nose while smiling and playing the devoted little wife." "You cannot prove that," Chloe whispered, her voice shaking so violently it was barely audible. "It was a marital dispute. It was his money. I was just securing my future." I stood up, leaning across the glass table, until I was mere inches from her trembling face. I wanted her to feel the absolute crushing weight of her own ignorance. "That is the absolute best part of all this, Chloe," I whispered, staring directly into her panic-stricken eyes. "It was not his money." She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "DeAndre was broke," I explained, enunciating every word with agonizing clarity. "He went to the shadow markets to secure a $10 million bridge loan. He needed emergency capital to keep his firm afloat. But those shadow lenders do not operate in a vacuum. They sell their debt. And do you know who bought his promissory notes, Chloe? Do you know who underwrote the exact specific $3 million that you wired to your brother?" I paused, letting the devastating reality sink into her bones. I stated, my voice echoing like a judge handing down a death sentence. "That was my investment fund. That was my capital you stole. You did not just steal from your incompetent husband. You committed federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and corporate embezzlement against my holding company." Chloe's knees finally gave out. She collapsed into the nearest leather chair, her hands trembling violently as she covered her face. The illusion of her grand escape was dead. Jonathan stepped forward, holding a single crisp sheet of paper. He slid it across the glass, stopping it right in front of her. "This is a federal subpoena, Chloe," I said, straightening my suit jacket, "and a formal notice of asset seizure. Your brother's Delaware company was raided at 6 this morning. The Cayman Island accounts have been entirely frozen by an international judicial injunction. You have absolutely nothing. You are completely destitute. Your brother is facing 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for acting as your accomplice. And you are going to be indicted for money laundering before the sun goes down today." Vivian let out a sharp, hysterical sob covering her face. Desmond stared at Chloe with a look of such profound, absolute disgust that it seemed to physically age him another 10 years. The daughter-in-law they had worshipped, the woman they had constantly elevated above me, had been the parasite secretly draining their lifeblood. "You wanted to play the high-stakes corporate game, Chloe," I said, walking around the table until I stood directly behind her chair. "You wanted to sit in my house, judge my background, and claim your inherent superiority. Look around you. Look at the absolute wreckage you and your husband created." I leaned down, my voice a deadly whisper right next to her ear. "You are not a victim. You are a thief. And you just stole from the one woman in Atlanta who has the power, the resources, and the absolute ruthless desire to bury you under the federal prison." "Jonathan," I called out, not taking my eyes off her shaking form. "Hand her the non-disclosure and asset forfeiture agreement." Jonathan slid a thick document next to the subpoena along with my titanium fountain pen. "You have exactly 2 minutes, Chloe," I instructed, pacing slowly behind her. "You will sign over complete total authorization of those offshore accounts back to my firm. You will waive all marital rights to any remaining assets in DeAndre's name. You will walk out of my penthouse wearing nothing but the cheap clothes on your back, and you will never speak the sterling name again. If you hesitate, if your pen stops moving for even 1 second, Jonathan will call the federal prosecutor and you will spend the next 15 years sharing a concrete cell. Chloe did not argue. She did not invoke her family name. She did not threaten to sue. She picked up the pen, her hands shaking so severely she could barely grip the metal barrel. She pressed the nib to the paper and began to sign her life away, tears of absolute terror and defeat splashing onto the legal documents. I watched her sign page after page, a beautiful symphony of total submission. The ultimate payoff was not just taking my money back, it was stripping her of the one thing she valued more than wealth. I had entirely eradicated her illusion of superiority. She came into my world expecting to conquer a charity case, and she was leaving as a documented criminal, completely broken and eternally bound to my mercy. Jonathan stepped forward and smoothly slid the signed forfeiture agreement from beneath Chloe's trembling hands. He capped the titanium fountain pen with a sharp, definitive click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Chloe remained slumped in the leather chair, staring blankly at her empty palms. She was a hollowed-out shell, completely neutralized. I turned away from her, discarding her from my mind as easily as one discards a broken toy. My gaze swept across the room to the two remaining architects of my childhood misery. Desmond was unraveling before my eyes. The sheer velocity of his total destruction had finally breached the walls of his arrogant delusion. He staggered backward, his polished leather shoes slipping on the marble floor. He reached out a shaking hand to grip the edge of the acrylic podium, but his fingers found no purchase. A ragged, wet gasp tore from his throat as his knees buckled. He clutched his chest, his face contorting into a mask of sudden, violent agony. The great Desmond Sterling, the untouchable titan of Atlanta real estate, crumpled to the floor. He lay there gasping for air, like a dying fish, his bespoke tuxedo pooling awkwardly around his collapsing frame. He was experiencing a severe cardiac event, brought on by the sheer terror of his impending federal prosecution, an absolute bankruptcy. I watched him struggle to breathe. I did not move. I did not call for a doctor. I felt absolutely nothing. Vivian, however, did not even look at her dying husband. Her survival instinct was entirely parasitic, and she recognized that the host she had clung to for 30 years was now dead. She scrambled across the floor, her heavy silver gown tearing beneath her knees. She dragged herself toward me, crawling over the shattered remnants of her shattered dignity. She reached out with both hands, her fingers hooking desperately into the rich crimson silk of my dress. She yanked the fabric, clinging to me like a drowning woman fighting for a piece of driftwood. "Nia, please!" She wailed, her voice a grating, hysterical screech that clawed at the quiet room. "You cannot do this. You cannot leave us like this. I am your mother. I gave you life. You are my daughter. Please, Nia. I am begging you on my knees. You have to forgive us. You have to save us. A mother and daughter have an unbreakable bond. You cannot throw your own mother into the street." Her face was a grotesque portrait of panic. Black mascara streamed down her cheeks, carving dark rivers through her expensive foundation. The pearls around her neck rattled violently as she sobbed, shaking my dress with pathetic, frantic energy. She was attempting to weaponize the very maternal bond she had spent my entire life starving and neglecting. She expected my humanity to override my strategy. She anticipated that the sight of my mother weeping at my feet would break my resolve and force a tearful reconciliation. She was vastly underestimating the monster she had helped create. I looked down at the woman gripping my dress. I did not see a mother. I saw a stranger who had stood idly by while I was systematically broken down. I saw the woman who had watched me pack my bags and walk out the door without shedding a single tear. I saw the enabler who had traded my future to subsidize the fraudulent existence of her golden boy. I leaned down, bringing my face level with hers. The frantic begging died in her throat as she met my eyes. She was looking for a flicker of sympathy, a shred of hesitation. She found nothing but a vast frozen wasteland. I reached down and grabbed her wrists. My grip was not violent, but it was entirely unforgiving. I slowly, powerfully peeled her fingers off the crimson silk of my gown. I stood back up, towering over her pathetic kneeling form. "You do not get to use that word," I said, my voice perfectly flat, stripping every ounce of emotion from the air. "You lost the right to call yourself my mother a very long time ago." Vivian let out a strangled whimper, wrapping her arms around her own stomach as she rocked back and forth on the cold floor. "You lost that right the day you packed my bags and sent me away." I continued articulating each word with lethal precision. "You traded me. You exiled your own daughter to protect the fragile ego of a useless son who is currently sitting in the back of an FBI transport vehicle wearing federal chains. You watched me walk out the door, and you smiled because you thought you had finally removed the only blemish from your perfect manufactured family portrait. You thought you were securing your legacy. Instead, you were simply signing your own death warrant." Desmond let out another weak groan from across the room, his hand clawing weakly at the carpet. Vivian squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to acknowledge him, rocking harder as my words rained down on her like heavy stones. "You thought I was weak because I was quiet," I said, stepping back from her. "You thought I was a fragile little girl who would simply fade into obscurity. But you forgot who took me in when you threw me away. You forgot whose blood actually runs in my veins. Do not ever try to invoke family loyalty to rob a wolf raised by Elias Sterling." Vivian flinched violently at the mention of the name. Elias Sterling, the true patriarch of the family. The ruthless, brilliant grandfather they had alienated because his standards were too high and his judgment too sharp. Elias was the man who had found me discarded and broken and had spent the last decade forging me into an absolute weapon. He had taught me how to read the markets, how to hunt toxic debt, and how to dismantle an opponent so completely that they could never rise again. He had left me his empire and his predatory instincts. My parents had foolishly believed they were the apex predators of Atlanta. They had absolutely no idea I had been trained by the apex predator of Wall Street. I looked at Vivian one last time. She was weeping into her hands, a broken, destitute woman who had traded her soul for a lifestyle she could no longer afford. I felt a profound, echoing emptiness. There was no joy in this final moment. There was no triumphant thrill. There was only the cold, necessary execution of absolute justice. "My work here is done," I stated, turning my back on her weeping form. I did not offer a goodbye. I did not spare a single glance for Desmond, who was now completely still on the floor waiting for the paramedics Jonathan had silently called minutes prior. I did not look at Chloe, who was shivering uncontrollably in the corner, a prisoner of her own greed. I walked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. My heels clicked against the marble with a steady, rhythmic cadence, a metronome marking the final seconds of my past. Jonathan fell into step behind me, a silent, efficient shadow holding the documentation of my total victory. I walked out of the suite, leaving the doors wide open behind me. I stepped into the private elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, they cut off the sound of Vivian's pathetic wailing, severing my ties to that room, to those people, and to that entire miserable chapter of my existence. The elevator descended smoothly, plunging me toward the lobby. I adjusted the lapels of my white jacket, feeling the cool, conditioned air of the building wash over my skin. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried since childhood was entirely gone. I was completely unburdened. I stepped out of the elevator and walked across the expansive lobby. The night concierge gave a respectful nod, immediately pushing open the heavy glass entrance doors. The humid Atlanta air hit my face, carrying the distant scent of rain and city asphalt. A sleek black town car was waiting, idling silently at the curb. The driver immediately stepped out, opening the rear passenger door and offering a professional, deferential nod. I slid into the plush leather seat, settling into the quiet darkness of the cabin. The driver closed the door, sealing me inside a fortress of absolute tranquility. "Take me home," I instructed, my voice calm and steady. The car pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the flowing traffic of the city. I looked out the tinted window, watching the bright neon lights and towering skyscrapers blur into a continuous stream of color. I had returned to Atlanta as a ghost seeking closure. I was leaving as the undisputed owner of the city. I did not look back. There was nothing left behind me but ashes, and I had an entirely new empire to build. I sit in the quiet, profound luxury of my penthouse sofa, the chaotic memories of that gala fading into the steady ambient hum of the present. The adrenaline of that particular night has long since dissipated entirely, replaced by a deep, unshakable serenity. I stand up, the soft, heavy fabric of my robe brushing against my legs, and walk slowly toward the expansive glass balcony. The heavy sliding door yields effortlessly to my touch, welcoming the cool night air into the room. The Atlanta skyline stretches out before me, a glittering, endless grid of ambition, power, and constant movement. From this elevated vantage point, the city looks like a glowing circuit board, and I am the one who successfully rewired the current. I grip the cold metal railing and look down at the streets below, completely detached from the catastrophic wreckage I left in my wake. The dust has finally settled, and the undeniable absolute truth of their destruction has been permanently cemented into the public record. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding, and terrifying certainty that my family was entirely unprepared for. DeAndre did not receive the miraculous 11th hour bailout he had spent his entire privileged life expecting. There were no high-priced fixers left to untangle his massive web of federal wire fraud and blatant racketeering. He attempted to barter, he attempted to blame his father, and he even attempted to feign ignorance. But the paper trail I handed the authorities was utterly flawless. The sheer volume of his stolen capital and his staggering, arrogant disregard for federal banking regulations earned him a mandatory 15-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. I attended his sentencing hearing not out of lingering familial obligation, but to personally witness the final absolute shattering of his delusion. When the federal judge read the guilty verdict, striking the heavy wooden gavel, DeAndre did not shout or curse. He simply deflated. The golden boy, the untouchable heir apparent, was reduced to a weeping, trembling shell of a man. His bespoke, tailored suits have been permanently replaced by stiff, standard-issue federal khaki. He spends his days confined to a tiny concrete cell entirely stripped of the luxury vehicles, the exclusive country club memberships, and the unearned toxic privilege that defined his entire hollow existence. Chloe fared no better in the aftermath. Her desperate, calculated attempt to funnel stolen capital through her brother's Delaware shell company unraveled in spectacular public fashion. The morning after the gala, federal agents executed a synchronized tactical raid on her brother's corporate offices, seizing every hard drive and freezing every offshore account connected to her name. Her pristine, noble lineage offered absolutely no protection against a grand jury indictment for international money laundering and corporate embezzlement. I was told her assets were frozen while she was attempting to purchase a first-class ticket to Paris, her platinum credit cards declining one by one at the airline terminal. The wealthy women in her elite social circles who once eagerly consumed her toxic gossip abandoned her, instantly treating her very name like a highly contagious disease. She lost her counterfeit designer bags, her luxury properties, and whatever remained of her manufactured superiority. She is currently awaiting trial, confined to a tiny rented apartment, drowning in insurmountable legal fees, and facing a decade in prison. The high society queen has been completely dethroned, left to reign over nothing but her own paralyzing fear and the terrifying reality of a federal courtroom. As for Desmond and Vivian, their spectacular fall from grace was meticulously chronicled on the front page of every major financial publication in the state. The bankruptcy was absolute, immediate, and entirely unforgiving. The banking institutions systematically seized their remaining phantom assets, the venture capitalists filed relentless secondary civil suits, and the Atlanta elite immediately erased them from their exclusive social registries. Vivian attempted to call her affluent friends for loans, but found her numbers blocked and her social invitations permanently revoked. They were formally evicted from the Alpharetta estate, with only a few humiliating hours to pack whatever meager personal belongings the federal liquidators allowed them to keep. They now reside in a cramped, decaying apartment complex on the far south side of the city. It is a grim, pest-infested building surrounded by the very poverty they spent their entire lives aggressively mocking and avoiding. The hallways smell of stale smoke and damp rot. Vivian no longer attends charity galas in custom silver gowns. She spends her days bitterly clutching her remaining costume jewelry in a dark living room, while Desmond stares blankly at a flickering television, completely stripped of his identity, his arrogance, and his empire. They are living a grim physical manifestation of the moral bankruptcy they inhabited for decades. Their crown jewel, the massive Alpharetta estate, was legally transferred to my holding company immediately following the foreclosure proceedings. I did not sell the property to recoup the debt. I did not renovate the sprawling mansion to live in it. Instead, I stood on the meticulously manicured front lawn on a crisp Tuesday morning and personally signaled the demolition crew. I watched with profound, quiet satisfaction as the heavy iron wrecking balls systematically shattered the grand marble columns and tore violently through the opulent master suites. I watched the massive formal dining room where I was told for years that I was socially unfit crumble into dust. The walls that had housed so much cruelty, so much deception, and so much toxic favoritism were violently reduced to a massive pile of shattered brick and twisted metal. The ground physically shook as the roof caved in, sending a massive plume of white dust into the sky. I stayed on the lawn until the very last structural beam collapsed, burying my miserable childhood memories under tons of pulverized concrete. In its place, I am funding the construction of the Elias Sterling Educational Center. I reviewed the final architectural blueprints on my desk just this afternoon. It will not be a monument to vanity or a fraudulent corporate headquarters designed to steal money. It is a state-of-the-art academy dedicated entirely to providing free world-class schooling-intensive mentorship programs and secure housing for young girls who have been abandoned, neglected, or cast aside by their own families. We are building advanced science laboratories, expansive art studios, and comprehensive psychological support wings. Where a monument to my parents' shallow narcissism once stood, we are building a fortress of genuine, unwavering empowerment. I am using the very soil that once marginalized me to cultivate a generation of fierce, unstoppable women who will never have to beg for a seat at the table because they will be uniquely equipped to build their own empires. It is the ultimate lasting tribute to the grandfather who salvaged my potential and the ultimate total erasure of the parents who tried so desperately to destroy it. I lean heavier against the cold balcony railing, letting the strong night wind wash over my face. The ambient noise of the city rises up to meet me, a beautiful, chaotic symphony of survival and relentless ambition. People often claim that blood is thicker than water. They use that phrase as a blunt weapon to demand blind loyalty, to enforce silent submission, and to excuse the most horrific acts of psychological abuse. They expect you to drown quietly just to keep their fragile, sinking family ship afloat. They demand that you sacrifice your own potential to insulate their spectacular failures. But I reject that philosophy entirely. Blood might be thicker than water, but power and absolute autonomy. That is reinforced concrete, and I am the exact person who poured the concrete to bury them. I take one last deep breath of the night air, savoring the crisp, clean taste of total, definitive victory. The city lights flicker below me, a vast ocean of endless, unyielding possibility. I turn away from the glittering skyline and step back into the warmth and safety of my penthouse. I slide the heavy glass door shut, locking out the noise, locking out the past, and stepping fully into the brilliant, undeniable light of my own making. The darkness has finally been vanquished.